In the dark shadows, in the white cold, fearlessly we search for knowledge new and old. We drink the strong spirits and read the ancient tomes. The order of the abracast. We are the brave and the bold.
Then, when the sacred months have passed, slay the idolaters wherever ye find them, and take them captive and besiege them, and prepare for them each ambush. But if they repent and establish worship and pay the poor due, then leave their way free. Lo, Allah is forgiving and merciful. This is the Quran. This is the sword verse, chapter 9, verse 5.
The Abracast, occult, history, conspiracy, and violence.
All right, welcome to the Abracast. I'm John Towers. We're going to be talking about one of my pet peeves tonight, and we will see, hopefully, why I'm always striving to put these things into context. Sometimes I'm sure it might even get frustrating for you. Why I always say that context is the worst enemy for conspiracy theorists. We're going to be talking about 9/11 today. We're actually going to be talking about 9/11 all week. And even though 9/11 is one of those huge, world-changing, history-altering events, we're going to be struggling to put 9/11 in context. So this is maddening. This is the maddening thing about 9/11 conspiracy theories. We get like 10 minutes into it and someone says, quote, you got to be an idiot to think 19 guys with box cutters did this, unquote. Or, quote, like an hour after the towers fell, bro, the government just suddenly knew Osama bin Laden did it. No one had ever even heard of that guy before, unquote. And what follows the probably 3+ hours of show that follows this week is my reply to this. I think this is going to be over 3 hours long. So obviously I'm not going to be talking about micro-nuclear explosives hidden in the buildings or invisible energy weapons, or that there were wizards involved who knocked the 2 towers down to make 1 tower as a ritual invoking transgenderism, or any of that silliness. We're going to be talking about real history. We're going to be talking about real geopolitics, and we're going to be talking about, politics and religion. So if you're the type of dude that needs a trigger warning, that was fucking it. You're in for a wild ride. But if you're interested, put your seatbelt on, grab your vessel of the art, pour your weapon of mass distraction, whatever your weapon of mass distraction happens to be. Mine is Jin Jihad here. as is especially appropriate for this evening. And it's going to be a bumpy ride. We're going to start the history of 9/11, rightly so, on 9/11, September 11th, 1683. We have detailed on the show Muslim expansion. After Muhammad dies, the Muslims pushed out and went through this time of rapid expansion. And eventually there was a string of caliphates and so forth. And we eventually end up with the Ottoman Empire. One of the things that, one of the areas or one of the regions that these Muslims always sought to conquer and to take was what they called the Golden Apple of Europe. It was Vienna. The city had been attacked and sieged by the religion of peace many times over the centuries. But this time was different. The Ottomans were determined, and they took time making plans and preparations, and they built up the infrastructure, widening roads, fixing and reinforcing bridges, and establishing a supply chain to move, feed, and supply the massive force they used to surround the walled city. On July 14th, the siege started. 140,000 Ottoman troops surrounded the city and demanded the city to surrender. But what you need to know is that the dude in charge of the defense of the city was this guy, Count Ernst Rudiger von Stromberg. You look at illustrations of him, like portraits of him, and he looks like kind of a bit of a dandy, but he was a badass. In my mind, he was like Lando Calrissian, with the cape, but he had like this little thin handlebar mustache, and you could just see him going like, well, what do we have here? As he cracks open a Colt 45. Anyways, they demanded that the city surrender. The Ottomans demanded that the city surrender, and they offered sort of terms for peace, saying that basically no one had to convert. They would just get taxed more, and they would get to keep all their stuff. You might remember this as the jizya. They were subjugated and taxed and sort of took this second-class status. However, von Stromberg told them to go and fuck yourself. Those probably weren't his actual words. He had only 15,000 soldiers and like 5,000 volunteers and around 370 cannons. But the walled city he was defending was huge. The major motivator in von Stromberg's stubbornness was that the Ottomans took a city just to the south of Vienna a few days earlier, and that city, when presented with the demands of surrender, they gave up. And, well, the Muslims didn't enslave or kill anyone. It was great. It was a peaceful day. Everyone was happy. There was cotton candies, hot dogs, and bouncy castles for the kids. I'm just kidding. The city surrendered and everyone was enslaved and slaughtered anyways. So the siege began and the Ottomans sent in sappers to mine under the walls. Von Stromberg and his soldiers countered this brilliantly, in my opinion, by tunneling under the walls themselves and intercepting the Ottomans' tunnels. I wrote a book about this. It was a short book. Okay, it was a comic book, but it was called Vienna 1683. It's out there, and this part of the story always fascinated me. When I was in the Army, I was a combat engineer, and the idea of this tunnel warfare was really cool to me. Anyhow, eventually a relief force was on its way to rescue Vienna, led by the King of Poland, Jan Sobieski III. He had 47,000 Germans and 27,000 Poles. I was going to say Polacks. I don't think that's right. We'll just rest on Poles. Sobieski sent his force on the plains to the east, and he lined up 18,000 horsemen, and Sobieski led 3,000 of his winged hussars. And you're probably like, what the fuck is a winged hussar? Well, here we go. I'll tell you about it. Winged hussars are these great, heavy shock troop cavalrymen. These guys were the elite Polish horsemen, Pole horsemen? I don't know. On their armor, they had these huge wings attached to their armor with like these eagle feathers and ostrich feathers. So imagine this. Sobieski on the front, or Sobieski in front of his hussars, and he led the largest cavalry charge in history into the Ottoman line. Imagine watching thousands of these heavily armored, huge, Eastern European dudes on these war horses with these wings, lances and swords rushing towards you. When these hussars got to the line, they crushed it. They just devastated this line. And due to the ass whipping they got in this tunnel warfare and just being raped figuratively by Sobieski and the hussars, the Ottomans were just massacred. Afterwards, Sobieski says of the battle, quote, "I came, I saw, and God conquered." Unquote. So, it is true that the Ottoman Empire limped along till 1922 or 23, but some historians mark Vienna 1683 as the event that started the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. This was the blow that the empire could never recover from, the downfall of the caliphates, September 11th, 1683. So if you're interested in this timeline that I'm about to run down, I would suggest you sign into the mailing list, the degree of the Fulgur Correspondentia. I spent a lot of time translating all this information into an infographic, and you can get it there. It's got a lot of these points in that I'm about to run through probably for like the rest of this episode. So let's get into it. 1886, the fucking automobile was born. 1903, the first official sustained controlled flight, the Kitty Hawk, the Wright brothers. There was actually a German guy named Gustav Whitehead in Pittsburgh that flew in 1899. He had a sustained flight in 1899, but this is the, quote, official account. 1916, the first tank was used in combat. This was the Battle of the Somme, which we covered some time ago on the show. 1926, an English engineer, A.A. Griffith, publishes a paper on compressors and turbines, in which he basically invents the jet engine. It took a couple of years to actually build one, but this is the dude who did it right here. What does this have to do with 9/11? This is it. I'm documenting the world becoming driven by petrofuel, which is basically the reason this section of the world becomes relevant globally. Right? 1938, Daman well number 7 in Saudi Arabia was drilled into, and what would soon be identified as the largest source of petroleum in the world. This discovery, as we will see, we already know, changed the political reality of Saudi Arabia, the Middle East, and the whole world. February 20th, 1945, on the way back from the Yalta Convention, Democrat President Franklin Delano Roosevelt meets with Saudi President Abdul Aziz. And they strike an agreement for the U.S. to get preferential treatment in oil for protection. Think blood for oil. This is it. It stretches all the way back to a Democrat in 1945. FDR says, "Yes, I agree to this," from his wheelchair. 1950, airliners are produced. 1957, Osama bin Laden was born. Bin Laden's dad was a wealthy business owner. He was in construction. Islamic law states that you can have 4 wives if you can provide for them. So since this guy was rich, he had 4 wives all the time, but he would divorce them and marry new ones. It was like a lazy Susan of wives. Anyhow, Osama's mom was a feisty Syrian, and his father called her the slave. You know, that's a cute pet name. And Osama was known as the son of the slave. You know, that's adorbs. I'm sure that didn't have any psychological impact on him, by the way, at all. In 67, ironically, Osama bin Laden's father was killed in a plane crash. The pilot was an American. I'm sure that didn't have any impact at all on him either. 1973, the construction of the World Trade Center is completed. In 1978, the People's Democratic Party, you know, if you ever hear that, the People's Democratic Party of yada, 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 they're communists. So the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan seizes power, and a civil war ensues between these commies, these pinko commies, and these Muslim freedom fighters. And these Muslim freedom fighters go on to become the Mujahideen, they're guerrilla fighters. 1978, the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan seized power, and a civil war ensues between these commie motherfuckers and the Muslims. These Muslim freedom fighters, the Mujahideen. Eventually, the Soviets got involved to back up these communist People's Democratic Party, yada yada, whatevers. They sent troops and tanks and helicopters. In 1979, the Camp David Accord, where the president of Egypt, Anwar Sadat, and the Israeli prime minister sign a treaty. The Egyptian president agrees to recognize Israel's right to exist. Put a pin in that. We're going to get back to it. And this drove the Middle East Muslims crazy. With the help of Jimmy Carter, Iran was thrown into turmoil when the Shah was overthrown by the radical Islamic leader Ayatollah Khomeini when he took over. To these guerrilla fighters, this sort of shows the world and sort of themselves that they can overthrow a government. And I'm sure they look back at this as like some kind of golden age. And to the rest of the world, it's a time of like piss and fire. You might be asking me, hey, John, what do you mean by that? And I'm not going to get into the whole thing, but if you want to see the best modern example of how backwards and regressive Islam is, just do an image search on Iran before and after the revolution. Iran used to be like America. They used to actually call it the West of the Middle East or something like, or the America of the Middle East or something like that. These hot chicks were walking around in mini skirts and fucking dancing and having fun. Not anymore. Tablecloths for you. Tablecloths for you. Tablecloths for you. 1979, there was a major terror thing where these terrorists took the Grand Mosque for a few weeks. In 1981, finally, we're gonna get some sense into this. We're gonna inject some sense into this whole fucking situation. Sense and a bunch of movie references. So Reagan's first term, 1981, he looks at Afghanistan and he thinks, correctly so, that this situation could be the Soviets' version of Vietnam. And the U.S. starts to support the Mujahideen. Think of Rambo 3. This is the reason Rambo 3 was in Afghanistan. John Rambo was a disgruntled Vietnam vet, and Afghanistan was a mirror to Vietnam. Global politics shift. Our interests usually stay the same. Our economy is intricately linked to oil. but we are going to see that the geopolitical landscape shifts constantly. So here's a point of a problem I have with the conspiracy folks. Often they are quick to point out that the Mujahideen and the Taliban and Osama bin Laden had ties to our intelligence gathering agencies. Osama bin Laden had worked with the CIA, and now he's fighting us. Yes, that's proof that it's an inside job or something. Well, that's the way the world works, and rightly so. We both had a common enemy. We were both fighting the communists. If Osama bin Laden did work with the CIA, do you think it was for the American way of life? If you think that, you're fucked. Back to Rambo 3. John J. Rambo was working with the Mujahideen for politics. It was not his personal baggage. It wasn't like Rambo was there working with the Mujahideen because he had found Islam in the federal penitentiary. He wasn't. He didn't convert to Islam. He was there for political reasons. He was fighting communists. Not to add another movie thing, but think of it as this: The Return of the Jedi. The Muslims were, we'll just say the Muslims were symbolized by these little Ewoks, and John Rambo was Luke Skywalker. And he was there to fight the Empire. And he was getting help, and he was helping the Ewoks. Do you think that Luke Skywalker stopped to worry or care about what weird god the Ewoks worshipped? Apparently, it looked just like C-3PO. Anyways, maybe this is the whole political meaning of Return of the Jedi. I don't know. Or do you think that Luke, Han, and Leo worried about the political implications of involving the Ewoks in their battle of Endor? Here's an interesting idea. What if after the end of the Battle of Endor, the Ewoks turned their cute little viciousness into a radical sort of ideology, and some years down the road did a 9/11 style attack on the planet of Coruscant? That's a good one. I mean, let's follow that fucking thread. J.J. Abrams, listen to this. Anyways, alliances are loosely threaded and will change, and have changed, and certainly did change when major parts of the environment change. Like, spoiler alert, when the Mujahideen won and the Soviets pulled out of Afghanistan, that shit changed everything. In 81, Anwar Sadat, the president of Egypt, the signor of the Camp David Accords, gets a fatwa issued against him. And he was assassinated during an annual victory parade. Kali Uzmabali, a lieutenant in the Egyptian army, stood up and sprayed Sadat with his Kalashnikov. Put a pin in this. This will come back later. After the assassination, over 300 of these Muslim Brotherhood types of fucking characters got locked up. They threw them all in this massive cage, or maybe it was like a stack of cages. You could see them in these videos. It's like this long wall of cages, and all these sweaty, miserable fucks are all like leaning against the bars, yelling and screaming blah 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 at each other. So all of this stuff is sort of background, but this is where the seed of 9/11 is actually planted, because behind this cage are a couple of key figures. There's Dr. al-Zawahiri, who is the future leader of Al-Qaeda and the future surgeon of one Osama bin Laden, and this other character, the blind sheikh, Omar Abdel Rahman. He was the leader of another Islamic militant group. We're going to be hearing a lot more about this motherfucker. Al-Zawahiri is an English speaker, and he's screaming at the press that is there filming all these sons of bitches. He's yelling in English, by the way. He's not yelling in Arabic or whatever. Like, he's yelling for the world to hear him. He's yelling about establishing an Islamic State and all this. He's saying, this is not factual. This is this is editorializing. He's yelling, "What do we want? To enslave people and murder infidels. And when do we want it? We want it now." There were 5 death sentences in the wake of this Sadat assassination. Al-Zawahiri is let go after 3 years in an Egyptian prison where he was tortured and wound up giving a bunch of his fucking boys up. The blind sheikh got out of prison too. They had a hearing, and his defense lawyer or whatever. Check out this reason they let him out of prison. Basically, they let him out of prison because this guy's blind. What's he going to do? What kind of trouble could he cause? Because he's blind. So they let him out. And as soon as he's out, he runs to Jordan and eventually winds up in he eventually winds up in Brooklyn preaching jihad. This is a crazy story. So this is also another thing we need to keep in our brains as we're going through this, because this is going to figure into the story. How did this motherfucker wind up in Brooklyn, New York? Anyhow, let's talk a little bit about the blind sheikh. This guy, sheesh. He looks like a fucking comic book villain, by the way. Well, not modern comic books, because, you know, we all know Muslims in modern comic books are always the good guy. There's no bad guy Muslim comic book characters. But classically, he wears this Santa Claus hat and these Blues Brothers Ray-Bans. He's got this crusty beard and his lips are always like dried out. And when you see him with these Blues Brothers glasses, and he's got like this one white eye that rolls around dryly in its socket, it's fucking disgusting. But he doesn't have a good story. You know, when you see his villainous ass or hear his name, you think, oh man, what if he blew his eyes out by trying to make a bomb? Or maybe he took a Soviet RPG to the face in Afghanistan, or maybe he was preaching so hard he went blind or something. Allah made him blind. I don't know. Really, he just went blind because he had type 2 diabetes. So, I've got to get back to the script. Okay, 1984, Brooklyn. The Al-Farouk Mosque was established and mainly used to radicalize Muslims and send them to Afghanistan to jihad against the communists. So it's a recruitment tool and a fundraising center. 85, the service office, which oversees operations and training center for the Mujahideen, start receiving training materials. These training materials were translated U.S. Army and Special Forces operation training manuals. Well, this is weird, right? They found this dude, Ali Muhammad, who was stationed at Fort Bragg, and he was supplying these guys with his training material from the JFK Special Warfare Center and school. Basically, it was this guy he was creating an encyclopedia of jihad. He got together all of these army manuals and started compiling and translating them. So Ali Muhammad enlisted when he was 34 years old. He was a sergeant at the time. You don't enlist in the army when you're 34 years old. I don't know what the limit is, but that's old. But here, there is an actual other side of it. He was a major in the Egyptian Special Forces. He was in the unit that actually killed Sadat. How does he find his way here? Why doesn't the military background check pick this up for a prior military record in a dubious past? So I'm going to ask you that question, and then I'm going to tell you an interesting story on the other side.
Learn more at abracast.com. Get bonus content and access to the private Abracast workgroup by signing up for the mailing list. Get all that plus many exclusive episodes by supporting the show at patreon.com or subscribestar.com. On this month's exclusive Order of the Fellowcraft episode.
Towards Mount Rainier, he saw 9 gleaming discs outlined against the snow, each one about the size of a C-54. Is it a function of false reporting? Is it a function of media incompetence or straight up misinformation? From my point of view, every, quote, flying saucer, unquote, story from this point on is at least a suspect for some sort of corruption. It has been over 2 years since the puzzling death of Captain Mantell. Mantell died mysteriously in the skies south of Fort Knox, but before his radio went silent, he sent a strange message to Goodman Air Force Base.
Support the show at patreon.com or subscribestar.com.
So you might be like, what are these background checks all about? Like, how, whatever can they be? And this is what I'm saying. When I was in basic training, my drill sergeants called a kid out. They asked if anyone in our families were high-ranking military. And they called this kid out because he didn't raise his hand. And they had already known that, they, meaning someone in Army intelligence, I suppose, had discovered that this kid's dad or his grandfather was a general in in the North Vietnamese army. Nothing happened to the guy, so you know. They should have just been able to figure out that this 34-year-old Egyptian was an officer in the Egyptian Special Forces, right? They couldn't figure out that guy's bullshit? I don't know. This is the first instance of a term that we are going to hear ad nauseum from this point on until we stop talking about 9/11. And that term is bureaucratic incompetence. Now, how was this dude able to get here? Bureaucratic incompetence. How was this guy able to get into the Army? Bureaucratic incompetence. How was this dude in Special Forces, or at least how did he have access to the training manuals in the JFK Special Operations Warfare Center and School? Bureaucratic incompetence. Remember, this is before the Army manuals were published online, right? This is back before online. This is back before the internet. The later it comes out that this guy's supervisors would write memos to Army intelligence voicing their suspicions that something was fishy with this dude. They suspected that he was leaking all this classified information. And no one ever cared. No one ever investigated. Why? CIA, I guess, maybe FBI. Maybe it was bureaucratic incompetence. This guy's unit commander would brief Army intelligence and nothing would ever happen. And he would later say, quote, I guess CIA ... unquote. So when you think about how much these manuals and these materials could be teaching, you know, what the Special Forces training is all about. So unconventional warfare is about, well, so Special Forces training is all about training in indigenous folks, right? So training, you know, you speaking their language and you training them. This isn't what happened ultimately was an inversion of that. Like they sent a bunch of Saudis over here to be taught by Americans to fly planes straight and level, You know what I mean? That's weird. But on top of that, they also teach kidnapping, assassination, and hijacking aircraft. But more than that, they are instilling these ideas, the 5 pillars of special operation forces. Not all of these apply, but stick with me. Humans are more important than hardware. 19 dudes with box cutters. Quality is better than quantity. Only 19 dudes. Special operation forces cannot be mass produced. Well, yeah, okay. Competent special operation forces cannot be created after emergencies occur. They can only be made before, I guess. They're the ones that are making these emergencies occur, I suppose, I guess is the implication. Most special operation forces require non-special force operation support. We're going to see a lot of this play into our story moving forward this week. So, well, okay, let's just take a look at these. Look at these principles and ultimately what happened on 9/11. Humans are more important than hardware. Strip this down. A box cutter is, it's just a box cutter. It isn't a Claymore mine. Is it an AK-47? It's just a box cutter. And a box cutter in the right hands of the right motherfuckers. 19 box cutter motherfuckers. Well, we know what can happen. Special operation forces cannot be mass produced. We'll just let that one go. Competent special operation forces cannot be created after emergencies because they are the emergency. I don't know if that's part of the pillar. I might have just made that up. Most special forces operations require non-special operations support. This is true with the 9/11 guys. They had handlers, they had pay people, they had flying instructors, and all of that stuff. This is a giant part of the puzzle that is falling into place. It turns out that al-Zawahiri has sent Ali Muhammad to the States to infiltrate the military. He had applied to the FBI. He actually, you're not even going to believe this, he worked briefly for the CIA and eventually enlisted in the Army at 34 years old. That's outside Army standards, I believe, but whatever. It's late. Back to our timeline. 1987, Berlin. Ronald Reagan famously tells Gorbachev, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall," which was like the stone cold stunner of the Cold War. If the Cold War was 1990s Attitude Era WWF wrestling match, at the same time, Reagan is sending Stinger missiles to the Mujahideen, allowing them to blast tanks and aircrafts out of the sky. 1989, Soviets pack up and leave Afghanistan, and the regional politics of the Middle East changes forever, bro. I think a lot of these guys thought that when they won, they would be welcomed into the U.S. and set up with property like fucking My Blue Heaven or something. I think that they might have been sort of this thought that the Mujahideen, they were helping the U.S. by fighting the Soviets, but in the end, the U.S. was like, "No, dog, we were helping you fight the Soviets." You pat them on the head and be like, "Oh, see you later, bros." So when the commies left, there was no reason for us to stick around. And we left too, leaving a war-torn country filled with refugees and burning shit everywhere. I'm not saying it was specifically in our purview to deal with all of that stuff. Everyone left the beautiful, picturesque Afghanistan, and these guys, the Mujahideen, victorious, heroic freedom fighters fighting against the oppression of communism, won. And they just kind of looked around and were like, "Well, we're pretty good fighters, and we got all these guns. What do we do now?" More on this a little later. 1990. the Soviet Union crumbles. The Cold War is over. The geopolitical landscape changes forever. I think it was H.W. I think he sums it up pretty good. President George H.W. Bush expressed his emotions. The biggest thing that had happened to the world in my life, in our lives, in this, by the grace of God, America won the Cold War. And meanwhile, back in Brooklyn, under the facade of this innocent-looking mosque, law enforcement is notified that the Al Farouk Mosque is buying thousands of rounds of ammo a month. Truckloads of these parishioners or whatever of the mosques would go to the Calvert gun range every month and do firearms training. The FBI would follow them and surveil them and take pictures of them. All the guns, I guess, were properly registered and so forth. One of these dudes, Syed Nosair, disguised as an Orthodox Jew, walks up to this firebrand rabbi, Meir Kahane, who was giving a speech in the New York Marriott East Side. This guy speaks out very loudly against Palestine. And he was the founder of the Jewish Defense League. Anyways, Nosair walks up and he blasts this rabbi point blank range. Bam, bam, bam. Shot him in the neck. Kahane would later die from his wound. Okay, so it wasn't bam, bam, bam. It was just one bam. But later, whatever. He shot him in the fucking neck. There was a shootout with the postal cop. This guy was trying to flee, but he wound up getting arrested. I think he got shot and arrested. In 2002, Eleanor Hill, who was the director of the Senate Intelligence Committee investigating the massive amounts of intelligence failures prior to 9/11, or as we now call them, quote, bureaucratic incompetence, unquote, reported that this dude had clear ties with the terrorist organization in Pakistan through the Al Farouk Mosque in Brooklyn, and that Osama bin Laden helped pay for this guy's legal defense. At the trial, he was found not guilty of the murder of Kahane, which is amazing. Despite the room full of witnesses and the people who were around to see the gunfight that ensued afterwards, the judge said, quote, "This verdict is against an overwhelming weight of evidence and devoid of common sense," unquote. And he eventually got a few years in prison for the gun charge. I think he was sentenced to 22 years, but I think he only served like 7, I think. So what's next? 1990, Saddam Hussein, a member of the Ba'athist Party, who actually has actual links to the National Socialist Party of Germany, the Ba'athist Party, who actually has links to Nazis, and the Iraq military invade Kuwait. Saudi Arabia feels threatened. So Iraq borders Kuwait, Kuwait borders Saudi Arabia. So bin Laden meets with the Saudis and he says, "Hey guys, I got my mujahideen motherfuckers right here. We got muscles, we got guns, we got experience and stuff, and we just got done beating the fucking Soviets. Why don't you let us come here and we will fight the Iraqis for you?" And the Saudis do not take him seriously at all. So let's tie some of this rambling together because of an agreement from the 40s that we have talked about. We are tied to Saudi Arabia through a preferential oil agreement where we get certain oil perks from them, but we have to defend them. So hostile forces invade Kuwait. Actually, the 4th largest army in the world invades Kuwait. Kuwait shares a border with Saudi Arabia, so we must act. This is from I mean, this is from FDR. This is actually reinforced in the Carter era. The blind sheikh shows up in Brooklyn, and you guessed it, the Al Farouk Mosque. Do you know how this fucking guy gets into the country? You guessed it. You guessed it, everybody. Bureaucratic incompetence. Or maybe it was payment for a job well done. So the biggest problem about this blind sheikh being here at the time is that he lends credibility to these motherfuckers. Because he's a legit, respected Islamic scholar. So law enforcement is over this, and they start to see the connections everywhere. The blind sheikh in al-Zawahiri is connected to the Sadat assassination. Ali Muhammad is also linked to the Sadat assassination. And the Egyptian Special Forces, which is connected to the Mujahideen. And he is connected to the gun training at the truckloads of Muslims from the Al Farouk Mosque. And Nasser was at the Al Farouk Mosque gun range. His legal defense bills were paid by bin Laden. The FBI, I mean, literally, it's all right there. The FBI take this Egyptian guy named Ahmed Salam, who is great. If you can find the interviews with this guy, he is awesome. He was in the Egyptian army, but he was on the side of Sadat. So he was one of Sadat, he was a loyalist of Sadat. And when the shit hit the fan, he took off to America. So the FBI put Salam in as an informant. He would just hang out at the protest on the side of Nasser's trial, and eventually meets Nasser's uncle, this guy named Al Jabroni. And like I've already mentioned, wrestling once or twice, but here we go. This guy's actual name is Al Jabroni. And Al Jabroni is going back and forth to Pakistan to meet with bin Laden for money for the defense of this guy who killed this rabbi. Salam eventually worked his way into the blind sheikh's circle and sold himself as like this bomb maker. So everything is crystallizing here. Financing, bin Laden and Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. Training, Ali Muhammad. The Saudi connection. Since our military is still in Saudi Arabia, folks there are starting to feel like they are being occupied. So this leads to the radicalization and recruitment, Wahhabist, jihadist legitimacy, the blind sheikh. And we can see sort of the beginnings of the blueprint right here for some nasty business. Salam is asked to build 12 pipe bombs. The FBI wants Salam to wear a wire, and he won't because he still has family in Egypt. And he's worried about them keeping their heads attached to their fucking bodies. The FBI, instead of working with this guy in order to keep one hand on the wheel, fires the dude. They just fire him. It's a small case of bureaucratic incompetence. So while Salam is away, a shifty son of a gun named Ramzi Youssef shows up, and he's like, yo, bros, screw the 12 pipe bombs. I'm going to build one big bomb. And everyone's like, for real, son? And he was like, yeah, for real. I'm going to build one big bomb. February 26, 1993, a truck entered the lower level or parking level of the North Tower of the World Trade Center. The plan was to blow the core of one of the towers and have it fall and crush the other tower. Well, they didn't know that the World Trade Center were built without or with minimal core support. The sturdy outside structure, the outside walls, are what actually held the towers together. We're going to talk about this very much in later episodes. The 1,310 pound urea nitrate hydrogen gas enhanced bomb exploded, opening a 100-foot wide hole in the 4 sublevels of concrete. 6 people lost their lives and 1,042 people were injured. Ramzi Youssef fled to Pakistan. On March 4th, Mohammed A. Salama got caught. He reported the rental truck stolen and went back to the Ryder truck rental place to get his deposit back. The FBI was there waiting for him. They had gotten the VIN number off the truck of the rear axle, which had been driven into the concrete at the blast site. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed found some of Ramzi Youssef's plans, and soon there would be sort of this perfect storm. Funding, plans, and a chance to change the world. Thank you very much for listening to the show. I'm John Towers, and this has been the Abracast. And stay tuned for 2 more parts of 9/11 in Context.
Thank you for listening to this episode. Send an email or visit us on social media to let us know what you think about this topic. And please remember to leave a 5-star rate and review. On this month's exclusive Order of the Fellowcraft episode.
Towards Mount Rainier, he saw 9 gleaming discs outlined against the snow, each one about the size of a C-54. Is it a function of false reporting? Is it a function of media incompetence or straight up misinformation? From my point of view, every, quote, flying saucer, unquote, story from this point on is at least a suspect for some sort of corruption. It has been over 2 years since the puzzling death of Captain Mantell. Mantell died mysteriously in the skies south of Fort Knox, but before his radio went silent, he sent a strange message to Goodman Air Force Base.
Support the show at patreon.com or subscribestar.com.